What is your childhood memory that you thought was normal but realized it was traumatic later in your life? Every time my dad would pick me up from school, he'd leave me in the car for 3+ hours whilst he went into the local pub and got drunk. Nothing to do. Just sitting there in the car. He'd come back after the few hours had passed and throw me a bag of chips as he started the car. I always thought I was the luckiest boy in the world to be getting those chips. As a kid, I used to brag about being able to sleep for over 24 hours straight to friends or teachers or really whoever would listen. I was mid-sentence mentioning it as a freshman in college when I realized my divorced father was drugging preschool me with cold meds so I'd sleep through his weekends of custody with me. It really screwed up my sense of reality for a while. My older sister used to play our Disney read-along tapes to my younger brother and I whilst guiding us through the words in the books. She taught us to read this way. I didn't realize till years later that she was using the tapes to cover the sound of our parents fighting downstairs. It saddens me that she never got to have a childhood. Went to pick up my uncle at a crack house when I was like 11. People sprawled out everywhere. Some lady was on the couch sleeping naked. Me and my cousins were just snickering cause we got to see boobies. My mother would have to regularly go on rescue missions to stop my grandmother from killing herself. I would get phone calls saying I'm on the way to grandma's again. One year on Halloween, I was probably about 8 or 9 years old. My mom didn't let my sister and me go outside to do some trick or treat in the neighborhood, but bought us a new Barbie movie and lots of sweets instead. Also, we were allowed to stay up as late as we wanted to. It was because she was afraid our father, parents were divorced, father abusive, would try kidnapping us. He had tried before. Still, it is one of my most treasured childhood memories because we had a great evening. Just my mom, my sesame. My father and I had a game when I was a child. Help daddy remember what hospital he went to last. My father was mentally ill and would hurt himself purposely to get more anxiety, antipsychotic and pain drugs. There were 5 hospitals within a 2-hour drive of us, and in those days, early 90s late 80s, there were no computer systems to track him like there is now. He would literally break his own fingers, burn himself with oil, anything to get what he needed. And it was my job to help him remember so he wouldn't get caught. After he took his life, when I was 12, I had a lot of feelings and scary memories to deal with. It's been a long hard road, but I hope wherever his is, he's not in pain anymore. In middle school, I started getting a lot of stomach itches due to undiagnosed acid reflux. I was also a really anxious kid, so I feared I was gonna throw up a lot. Thus, almost every night I'd take half a Tums. When I offhandedly told my best friend, she looked terrified. "I think you might be addicted to Tums," she said. We had just learned about addiction, and I told her I didn't feel withdrawal without the medicine, and that I was just taking it as prescribed. She still seemed unconvinced, so I told her she was being silly and dropped it. In high school, I learned her brother's drug addiction had been tearing the family apart, and she was probably terrified one of her closest friends was using too. My stepdad would frequently play fight me and my sister when my mom wasn't home, but his play fighting was actual abuse. Most of the abuse was punching and stuff, but the worst one I remember was him tying me to a chair with a shit ton of duct tape and tying my mouth and just leaving me there for over an hour. My mom leaving me at different places with different people for months at a time, or when we would be driving. I remember there would be times where she would tell me about the school she was going to take me to, and that I would live there. I remember her describing the horses they had, lies, and how much I would love it. She never ended up taking me there, but would always talk about it like it was some magical place. Found out from my uncle years later it was an orphanage. Only reason she didn't end up taking me is because he threatened to kill her if she did. This question reminds me of that redditor whose mom made him have a butt plug in at all times in fear of the devil doing butt stuff or something. The mom got busted when he had to use the bathroom during school and asked the teacher to help remove his poop plug, or whatever he called it as a kid. Was truly a screwed up story in a similar Ask Reddit thread. When I was 8 till I was about 10, the school else teacher would sometimes pull me out of recess to sit down with me and play weird games. I hated it because it meant I wasn't outside writing my stories, and besides, I was a native English speaker. Why did I ever need to do anything with the English as a second language teacher? Yeah, turns out she was a counselor and she was trying to get enough information to show that I had signs of autism/AD/learning disorder to give to the National Health Service and get me an actual psychologist because my parents were refusing to send me to one. Unfortunately, her husband died before she could finish, and I didn't end up going to one until I was 17, when I was legally allowed to do that sort of thing on my own. When I was in kindergarten, they would make us kneel in a corner on some wood piece or STH. That was utterly painful for every time we hurt each other or cursed, which happened a lot apparently, and as soon as I got to elementary school I asked the teacher the first time I was in trouble where I should go kneel. They took attention to that, and long story short, they called the police on our old kindergarten, and it's now closed since 2006. Edit. To clarify a few questions. This took actually place in Eastern Bavaria in the early 2000s. It was a Catholic kindergarten and all of this was considered rather normal inside its walls. My mom decided to toughen me up by having a pick on Alpha Pretty Wednesday after I got in trouble at school for being a tattletale. She made my sisters and I sit at the kitchen table while they each said something shitty to me. At first they thought it was a joke, so they would giggle and say silly stuff. Then my youngest sister said she hated my smile. It finally stopped when I started crying, and my other sister shouted at mom that she wasn't going to do it anymore and ran out of the room. 15 years of therapy. My dad going to the bar every night and only got to see him when he was drunk or not at all. Always had a plate of dinner saved for him. He would usually scream at my sisters and mother if he did get home early enough. On a side note, reading this post is sad AF. When I was about 10, my mother had to leave the country for work for almost a year, so she left me to live with her longtime boyfriend. Every night he'd come home drunk, which I thought was hilarious. He'd come into my room and sit on my bed touching me, especially on the butt, and tell me how much I look like my mother, and try to pull my sheets off. I'd just pretend to sleep. I got annoyed that he kept waking me up, so I started locking my door at night. The dude broke off the lock and kept doing it. He also once threw a plate at me he missed for giggling at lunch. I never thought of telling my mum about this because I thought it was normal. When I was young I was really good friends with a girl whose grandparents lived across the street, and we got along really well and would hang out all the time. At some point, I was maybe 4 or 5 at the time, she invited me to her uncle's house and they had a big above ground pool built into their deck and we went swimming. Eventually we got out, but we both wanted to get back in, and the uncle said if we wanted to go back into the pool we had to skinny dip. Again, we were both no older than 5. But we did. It took a long time for me to realize the severity of the situation, the implications. IDK. Half of me feels like it was harmless, half of me is like damn, who the fuck does that? When I was around 8, my best friend at the time used to steal bad food from her pantry, and we'd go into her room and she'd then explain to me how we had to be skinny because being skinny meant boys would like us, and so she would then meticulously read the backs of the cookie packs and count out every cookie and how many calories there were for each of us. She also was obsessed with shaving all her body and would try and pressure me into shaving my legs and arms. Once again, boys liked it when you were hairless. I never really grasped how bizarre it was for 8-year-olds to count calories and be hairless for boys. Years later my primary school had a national scandal where 10 to 12-year-olds were sexually abusing each other on the mat during class, at lunchtime, and any opportunity they had. I can remember lots of peer pressure for kids to finger each other and make out because that meant you were cool and liked by the hot boys. I was very fortunate to not be involved, and looking back it honestly so screwed up. Don't know if any of it was related, but just from 7 to 12 it was quite gross. My brother used to scream at me and physically and mentally abuse me. He said it was just an older brother thing. Also the way my schizophrenic dad acted when he was off his meds. I thought it was hilarious when he described his suicide attempts because I thought, who would die on purpose? I often heard him retell his stories to make me laugh. I feel extremely guilty now. Either that, whenever a kid got home late it was normal for them to be locked outside for the night. Also thought an appropriate response to not doing your chores was to be locked in a closet without food. My younger siblings never got this treatment. I just thought I was an extra awful child.